Welcome to History Unraveled. Have you ever wondered how a city, a glittering imperial capital, could last for over 1,000 years and then suddenly, in a matter of weeks, be gone?
It really is an incredible story when you think about it. This is a Constantinople in 1453, and it wasn't just any city.
Right, exactly.
It was the heart of the Byzantine Empire. It had stood against countless sieges. It had these almost mythical defenses.
Yeah, those Theodosian walls. They always get mentioned when we talk about Constantinople.
Exactly, the Theodosian walls. For 800 years, they'd held strong. They were some of the most advanced fortifications in the world at that time.
And it was a place of immense wealth, culture, a real crossroads of the world.
Exactly, a vital bridge between East and West.
So in this deep dive, we're going to look at what happened. How could such a seemingly invincible place fall? You shared some amazing research with me, and I know our listeners sent in some great material too.
It's an epic tale, and there's so much to unpack. I think we'll find some real aha moments for sure.
I think so too. Let's start with some context. Constantinople had been around for, what, almost 15 centuries by this point?
Yeah, that's right. Founded in 330 AD by Constantine the Great, it became this imperial capital right at the crossroads of Europe and Asia.
And during that time, it had only been captured once, right?
Yes, only once before 1453.
And that was during the Fourth Crusade.
Exactly, back in 1204. A pretty wild chapter in itself. But by the mid-15th century, things were different. The Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. It had been ravaged by the Black Death.
That was a huge blow. I mean, the plague hit Europe hard, but it seems like Constantinople was particularly devastated.
That's right. We're talking potentially half the population gone between 1346 and 1349.
Unbelievable. And that obviously had a huge impact on their ability to defend themselves.
Absolutely. Fewer people meant fewer soldiers, less tax revenue. The empire just couldn't bounce back. They were also constantly losing territory. Conflicts drained their resources.
So by the 1450s, what did the Byzantine Empire actually consist of?
It was basically reduced to Constantinople itself, a few islands nearby the Prince's Islands, and a little slice of the Peloponnese, a far cry from the vast empire it once was.
And into this incredibly vulnerable situation walks a young, ambitious sultan, Mehmed II, only 21 years old.
I know. You look at him and it's hard to believe this is the guy who would finally conquer Constantinople. A lot of the European courts underestimated him, thought he was just a young, inexperienced ruler.
But he clearly wasn't.
No, not at all. He was incredibly intelligent, driven, and ambitious. He'd been obsessed with Constantinople since he was a child. It was a prize that had eluded his forefathers for generations.
He was determined to make history.
Absolutely. And on the other side, you have Emperor Constantine Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor. Talk about being dealt a bad hand.
He knew the stakes, the weight of history on his shoulders.
You can only imagine. He was
Yeah.
facing this monumental task with dwindling resources, a divided city, and not much help from the outside world.
So let's talk about that siege. It lasted for 55 days, April 6th to May 29th, 1453. What were Mehmed's initial moves?
Well, he knew he couldn't just march up to Constantinople and expect it to crumble. He needed to isolate it, cut off its supply lines.
And he did that by building Rumeli Hisari.
Right, a massive fortress built in record time on the European side of the Bosphorus.
That was a brilliant strategic move, wasn't it? It basically cut off any help coming from the Black
Oh,
Sea.
exactly. And it was placed right opposite Anadolu Hisari, another fortress built by one of his ancestors.
So together, these two fortresses controlled the strait. They even called Rumeli Hisari Bohaskesen, which means strait blocker, or literally throat cutter.
Yeah, pretty intimidating. It's a reminder that Mehmed wasn't messing around. He also deployed troops to the Peloponnese to prevent Constantine's brothers from sending reinforcements.
So he's isolating the city, preparing his troops. What else was going on?
Well, there was this massive logistical effort to transport the Ottoman artillery. They had to move these huge cannons, including this monster cannon called the Basilica.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that thing. Absolutely enormous.
Yeah, 27 feet long. It could launch a 600-pound stone ball over a mile.
But I imagine something that big had drawbacks.
Oh, for sure. It was notoriously slow to reload, like 3 hours between shots. And the ammunition was limited. There are even accounts of it collapsing under its own recoil.
Wow. So while the Ottomans were getting ready, Constantine was desperately seeking help from the West. But there were some deep-rooted issues, right? The whole East-West church schism was a major obstacle.
Absolutely. The division between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches had been around for centuries at this point. And it wasn't just about theological differences.
There was a lot of bad blood between the Greeks and the Latins.
Exactly. The massacre of the Latins in 1182, the sack of Constantinople in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. These events created a lot of mistrust.
So even though Constantine was desperate, many in Constantinople were wary of accepting help from the Catholic West.
Especially if it meant submitting to the authority of the Pope, which was a key condition for aid.
So did any help actually arrive?
Some, but not nearly enough. And it was delayed. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev arrived with a small contingent of archers.
Sent by the Pope.
Yeah, funded by him at least.
Yeah.
And a very capable Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, arrived with about 700 soldiers.
That must have been a relief.
It was. Constantine appointed him overall commander of the land defenses. There were also a few Venetian ships in the harbor that pledged their support.
It sounds like a pretty mixed bag. Was there anyone else?
Let me think. Oh, yes, there was Gabriele Orsini del Balzo,
Who was he?
a condottiero from Naples. Basically a mercenary captain. He brought around 200 archers with him.
200 more wouldn't have made that much difference, though, would it?
Probably not, no. But tragically, it gets worse. Just as Giustiniani arrives, 7 Italian ships, full of soldiers who had sworn to help, they just sail off.
Deserted.
Yeah, just abandon the city.
I can't imagine how demoralizing that must have been. Talk about a blow to their hopes.
Exactly. And to add insult to injury, Constantine tried to appease Mehmed with gifts, but Mehmed had him execute his ambassadors. It was a very clear message.
No negotiation.
Exactly. So the Byzantines were on their own, facing this overwhelming force, but they still had their defenses. Let's talk about those.
Those legendary defenses.
Yeah.
I think we have to start with the chain across the Golden Horn. It's such a striking image. This massive chain, strong enough to hold back an entire fleet.
Yeah, it was a crucial part of their strategy. It stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, supported by these big floating logs. It was meant to stop the Ottoman ships from getting into the harbor. They'd learned the hard way in 1204 when the Crusaders attacked from the Golden Horn.
They weren't going to let that happen again.
Exactly. And of course, there were the land walls.
Those Theoposian walls.
Yep, they were the main line of defense, especially the section near the Blachinae district. That was seen as a bit of a weak spot, so they reinforced it as much as they could.
So what did these walls actually look like?
It was a pretty complex system. First, you had a wide moat.
Full of water, I assume.
Yeah, a real obstacle. And then there was an outer wall, lower than the main wall.
Sort of like a first line of defense.
Exactly. And then behind that was the main wall. It was massive, with all these towers spaced out every 45 to 55 meters. Just a daunting obstacle for any attacker.
It sounds incredible. So let's look at the forces involved. What was the actual size of the Byzantine army?
It was much smaller than you might think. We're talking maybe around 7,000 men. And 2,000 of those were the foreigners who came to help.
So only around 5,000 actual Byzantine soldiers.
It's pretty shocking. They even did a census in March 1453, and it showed they only had about 4,773 Greek men able to fight.
So they really were outnumbered.
Oh, yeah, severely. But it wasn't just about numbers. The Byzantine army was a bit of a mix. You had some seasoned soldiers.
So professionals.
Right. But then there were armed civilians, sailors, volunteers, even monks who took up arms.
Monks with swords. That's an image.
I know, right? And they had some small cannons, but they were no match for the Ottoman artillery.
So it sounds like a pretty desperate situation. But despite the odds, the citizens of Constantinople, they really stepped up, didn't they?
They did. They worked tirelessly repairing the walls, keeping watch, getting supplies to the soldiers. They even donated gold and silver from their churches to pay the foreign soldiers.
Real dedication to their city. So how did this small force stack up against the might of the Ottoman army?
Well, the Ottomans had a huge numerical advantage. Modern estimates put their army somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 men.
That's an incredible difference.
Yeah, it really shows the power Mehmed had at his disposal. And among those troops were the Janissaries.
The elite troops, I've read they were incredibly disciplined, utterly fearless.
Exactly, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 of them. And they had about 70 cannons, some of them huge.
Yeah.
Don't forget, the Ottomans also had Christian troops. They were a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire.
Right.
There were around 1,500 Serbian cavalrymen supplied by the Serbian despot Uro Brankovic.
Isn't it ironic that he had actually helped fund the repair of those very walls he was now attacking?
Right. History can be strange like that. Now, some older sources, especially from the West, put the Ottoman army at some ridiculously high numbers, like 160,000, even 300,000.
Exaggeration, or were they genuinely that big?
Most historians now think those numbers are way off. They were powerful, but not that powerful. And their fleet was formidable, too.
How many ships are we talking about?
Estimates vary, but it was probably around 110 ships.
That's still a lot of ships.
It was. They had galleys, transport ships, everything they needed to move troops and supplies.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the cannons again.
Right, those cannons. We talked about the Basilica, which was a monster. What other artillery did they have?
They had a whole range of cannons, from smaller ones to these massive bombards. They had skilled engineers, both Turkish and foreign, who built these things. A Turkish engineer named Saruka designed a particularly large bombard.
But there was also that Hungarian or maybe German guy named Orban, who was responsible for the Basilica.
Exactly. We don't know a lot about him, but he clearly knew his stuff. It must have taken an incredible amount of effort to bring all those cannons to Constantinople.
I can't even imagine.
They had this big foundry about 150 miles away, and they had to drag these things over land. The Basilica alone needed 60 oxen and over 400 men just to move it. It gives you a sense of just how determined Mehmed was.
It's mind-boggling. So the Ottoman army arrives at Constantinople. Where do they set up camp?
Most of the army set up south of the Golden Horn.
Makes sense. That's where the land walls are.
Exactly. The European troops, under Karaca Pasha, were deployed along the walls. The Anatolian troops, led by Ishak Pasha, were further south.
And Mehmed himself.
He set up his tent near the Mesotation.
Why there?
It was a central section of the land walls and was considered one of the weaker points. It was also where they placed most of their big guns.
So right in the heart of the action.
Yeah, and the Janissaries, his elite troops, were right there with him. And behind them were the Bashi bazooks.
Those are the irregular troops, right?
Right. They were known for being pretty fierce, but not always disciplined.
They sound kind of terrifying.
Yeah, they had a bit of a reputation. But they also had another force north of the Golden Horn, led by Zaglan Pasha.
So the city was completely surrounded.
Completely. And don't forget, they were masters of siege warfare. They knew how to keep their camp clean, how to dispose of bodies, how to manage water sources. They were in it for the long haul.
Prepared for anything. Now, on the Byzantine side, how did they deploy their limited forces?
Well, they knew they couldn't man the entire length of the walls. They just didn't have the manpower.
They had to prioritize.
Exactly. So Constantine himself, with the bulk of his Greek troops, went to the Mesotation.
The spot Mehmed was targeting.
That's right. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, was initially at the Teresian Gate, but then he moved his troops to reinforce the Mesotation.
Smart move.
Yeah. They needed their best troops at the most likely point of attack. The Venetians were mostly stationed at the Blanchernay Palace, which is in the northern part of the city.
And what about all the other sections of the wall?
It was a bit of a patchwork. You had Genoese troops at the Petit Gate, Venetians defending the southern section of the Theodosian Wall.
And what about the seawalls?
They had Venetian and Genoese sailors guarding those. They even had a reserve force stationed near the Church of the Holy Apostles, ready to respond to any breaches.
They were really trying to cover all their bases.
They had to. So with everyone in position, the siege begins. And one of the first things Mehmed did was to mop up any remaining Byzantine strongholds outside the city.
Sort of tightening the noose.
Exactly. They took the fortress at Theropia, a castle near Studius, and probably the Prince's Islands as well. Then the real bombardment began.
Weeks of cannon fire.
Yeah, day after day. But those walls, especially the Theodosian walls, they were surprisingly resilient. The Byzantines were constantly repairing the damage.
So the cannons weren't as effective as Mehmed might have hoped.
Not at first.
Yeah.
And at sea, they were also having trouble. That chain across the Golden Horn, it really was a problem for the Ottoman fleet. They couldn't get past it.
Until that incredible moment when those Christian ships broke through the blockade.
Oh yeah, that was a huge boost for the Byzantines. 3 Genoese galleys and a big transport ship.
Full of supplies.
Exactly what they needed. And it was a major embarrassment for Mehmed. He was furious with his admiral, Baltoglu.
I read that he had Baltoglu stripped of his wealth and whipped. 100 lashes.
Yeah, that was the punishment for failing the Sultan.
A pretty clear message to the other commanders. But Mehmed wasn't one to give up easily. And then he comes up with this unbelievable plan.
The overland transport of his ships.
I still can't get over how audacious that was. Just dragging warships over land, past the chain, and right into the Golden Horn.
It was a brilliant maneuver. It completely changed the game. And it must have been terrifying for the Byzantines to see those ships suddenly appearing in their harbor.
What could they do?
Well, they tried to attack them with fire ships.
Those were basically floating bombs, right?
Right. Old ships packed with flammable materials.
But it didn't work.
No. The Ottomans were ready for them. And tragically, many of the Christian sailors who launched those fire ships were killed.
A desperate attempt that backfired.
Yeah. And the aftermath was brutal. Mehmed had about 40 Italians impaled.
Impaled. That's horrible.
It was a horrific sight. And the Byzantines retaliated by executing 260 Ottoman prisoners.
So it's just escalating. The brutality is just getting worse.
No, sir.
So with the Golden Horn now contested, Mehmed focuses again on the land walls.
Yeah, they launch a series of massive assaults. But those walls hold firm.
Those Theodosian walls were living up to their reputation.
They were. But these attacks were costly for the Ottomans. Niccolo Barbaro, a Venetian surgeon who was there, he wrote about how relentlessly the Janissaries attacked.
They didn't care about losses.
It seemed like it. Barbaro wrote about how they would keep trying to retrieve the bodies of their fallen comrades. Even under heavy fire, it was almost suicidal.
Incredibly determined.
Yeah.
When these frontal assaults failed, Mehmed turned to tunneling. Right.
Exactly. They started digging tunnels under the walls, hoping to collapse them from below. They had these skilled Serbian miners who were experts in this kind of thing.
But the Byzantines were ready.
They were. They dug countermines, led by an engineer named Johannes Grant.
Who was he?
We don't know much about him, but he's thought to have been Scottish.
A Scotsman defending Constantinople.
Yeah, history is full of these little surprises. They would intercept the Ottoman tunnels, fight them underground, and they would use Greek fire.
That was pretty terrifying stuff.
Yeah. Imagine being trapped in a narrow tunnel with flames shooting at you. It must have been nightmarish. And then they managed to capture a couple of Turkish officers.
And get information about the tunnels.
Exactly. They tortured them, and they revealed the locations of all the Ottoman tunnels. So the Byzantines were able to neutralize the threat. It was a huge victory for them, even if it was underground, out of sight.
A hidden war beneath the main siege. So the siege drags on, the fighting is brutal.
Yeah.
At some point, Mehmed offers Constantine terms, doesn't he?
He does. On May 21st, Mehmed sends an ambassador into the city with a final offer. Surrender, and everyone can leave safely.
He would even let Constantine rule the Peloponnese.
Yeah, as an Ottoman vassal. But Constantine refused.
I guess he felt like surrendering meant betraying everything the Byzantine Empire stood for.
You can understand his thinking. He reportedly said, "As to surrendering the city to you, it is not for me to decide or for anyone else of its citizens, for all of us have reached the mutual decision to die of our own free will without any regard for our lives."
So no surrender. A heroic, but maybe a bit tragic decision. And that leads to Mehmed's final war council.
Right. He had to decide what to do next. There was actually some disagreement among his advisors.
Really? I thought everyone was just following him blindly.
Not exactly. Halil Pasha, one of his most senior advisors, he urged Mehmed to abandon the siege.
He thought it was too risky.
Exactly. Too many losses, and it was dragging on. But another advisor, Zogan Pasha, he argued for a final all-out attack. He thought the Byzantines were on their last legs.
So what did Mehmed decide?
He sided with Zagan Pasha. He was convinced that one final push would be enough to break through.
It was a huge gamble.
It was. And he threw everything he had at it. So the preparations for the final assault begin. We're talking about an immense mobilization of troops. It took about 36 hours to get everything ready. And then on May 28th, he gave his soldiers time to pray and rest. He knew they'd need all their strength for the battle ahead. On that same day, a small Venetian fleet arrives at Constantinople.
I guess that was the last hope for reinforcements.
It was, but they had bad news. There was no big relief force coming from Venice.
So Constantine knew he was on his own.
Absolutely. And meanwhile, in the city, there are these huge religious processions, people praying for a miracle. And in the Hagia Sophia, they hold this very emotional Vesper service. It was a moment of unity, with both Latin and Greek clergy present.
A city preparing for its final hours.
It must have been incredibly tense. And then, shortly after midnight on May 29th, it begins. The final assault.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like.
First, they sent in the less experienced troops. The Christian auxiliaries, the Azaps.
The cannon fodder.
Yeah, basically. And then the Anatolian Turkmen. They were aiming for the Blachernay walls, which were the weakest part of the defenses. And they actually managed to breach the wall at one point.
So they got into the city.
They did, but they were quickly pushed back.
So the walls held, at least for a while.
For a while. But then Mehmed unleashed the Janissaries. This was the final push, the elite troops going all out. And it was during this intense fighting that Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, is badly wounded.
That must have been devastating for the defenders. He was their best commander.
Absolutely. He had to be evacuated, and his departure caused panic among the other defenders.
Like their leader had abandoned them.
Yeah, it must have felt like that. And then the Ottomans finally break through.
Where was Constantine during all this?
He was right there in the thick of it, fighting alongside his men.
What a scene that must have been. The last Byzantine emperor defending his city to the death.
It was the end of an era. The accounts vary a little, but it seems he died fighting on the walls.
A heroic end. But what about the people inside the city? What happened to them?
It was chaos. The Ottoman troops flooded into the city. They quickly took control of key buildings like the Church of the Holy Apostles, where Mehmed planned to install his own patriarch.
He was already thinking about how to govern the city.
Oh, yeah. He was a very strategic thinker. And sadly, there were a lot of casualties. A lot of the defenders were killed, including the Catalan troops who fought to the very end.
They were all killed.
Yeah. Mehmed had their leaders executed, and the rest were probably massacred.
Tragic.
But some civilians did manage to escape. A Venetian captain, seeing what was happening, broke open the chain across the Golden Horn and let his ships, full of refugees, escape into the Sea of Marmara. Some Genoese ships followed them, and eventually the Ottomans secured the entire harbor.
So the city was completely theirs.
Completely. And then they converged on the Hagia Sophia.
The greatest church in Christendom.
Exactly. Thousands of terrified civilians had taken refuge inside, hoping for some kind of miracle. But the Ottomans broke down the doors.
What happened to the people inside?
They were rounded up, separated. The Ottomans were looking for valuables, and they were looking for slaves. It was a terrible scene.
It's hard to even imagine.
One Venetian eyewitness, Niccolo Barbero, he wrote about how the blood was flowing in the streets like rainwater. He said the bodies in the sea look like melons bobbing in a canal.
A very vivid and disturbing image.
It gives you a sense of the horror of that day, and then the looting began.
Mehmed had promised his soldiers 3 days of plunder.
Right. And they took full advantage. They rampaged through the city, looting homes, destroying churches, taking anything of value.
Were there any attempts to stop them?
Well, Mehmed did try to prevent a complete sack of the city. He knew Constantinople was a valuable prize, but those first 3 days were brutal. When Mehmed toured the city on June 2nd, he was reportedly devastated by what he saw.
He felt remorse.
It seems so. He's quoted as saying, "What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction."
So it wasn't all just cold calculation on his part.
He was definitely ambitious, ruthless even, but it seems like he wasn't entirely heartless.
But the brutality was undeniable.
It was. There are accounts of widespread slaughter, mass enslavement, rape. The Venetian Senate even issued a report detailing the deaths of hundreds of their citizens.
And many historians think the Ottomans were actually worse than the Crusaders had been back in 1204.
There are definitely arguments to be made on both sides. But the suffering was immense, regardless of who was worse.
Some sources paint a particularly horrific picture of what happened.
Yeah, some of the eyewitness accounts are truly harrowing. They talk about men, women, and children being slaughtered in the streets.
It's awful.
And the sexual violence was widespread. Leonard of Chios, an archbishop who was there, he wrote in detail about the rape of nuns, women, children. It's really hard to read.
These weren't just soldiers following orders, were they?
It seems like there was a real sense of vengeance, a desire to punish the city for resisting. They saw it as a holy war, and they were taking their reward.
It's a dark side of human nature. And all this was happening in a city that had been a center of civilization for centuries.
It's hard to grasp the scale of the tragedy. And it wasn't just about the violence. It was about the destruction of culture, the loss of knowledge. Libraries were burned, churches were desecrated, art was stolen. It was a huge blow to the Byzantine world.
So after those 3 days, Mehmed tries to restore order.
Right? Yeah, he does. He lets the remaining citizens return to their homes, promises to protect them. He even appoints a new patriarch for the Orthodox Church.
He was being pragmatic, I guess. He needed to stabilize the city, get things running again.
Exactly. And that's when he goes to the Hagia Sophia.
What happened there?
It was a very symbolic moment. He enters the church, has the altar desecrated, and then a muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. It was the official conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque.
The end of an era. And how did the West react to all this?
They were shocked, terrified. They saw it as a catastrophe for Christendom.
They must have known it was coming, though, right?
They did, but maybe they hoped for a miracle. Maybe they thought the West would finally come to the rescue.
But it was too little, too late.
Exactly. There were calls for a new crusade. Pope Pius II was really pushing for it, but Europe was too divided, too focused on its own problems.
And Mehmed knew that. He knew they wouldn't be able to mount a serious challenge.
He was a master strategist. And the fall of Constantinople was just the beginning. He went on to conquer more territory. The last remnants of the Byzantine Empire were finally extinguished when the Mauryan Despotate fell in 1460.
That was ruled by Constantine's brothers, wasn't it? What happened to them?
One of them, Thomas, fled to Rome. The other, Demetrius, was captured.
And the Empire of Trebizond.
Gone in 1461. That was the final nail in the coffin for the Byzantine world. But there is an interesting little twist.
Whoa, what's that?
Constantine's nephews, the sons of his elder brother, they ended up serving in Mehmed's court.
So the potential heirs to the Byzantine throne ended up as Ottoman officials.
Yeah, one of them became the governor general of Rimini, and the other became an admiral and even served as grand vizier.
That's a pretty wild turn of events.
Mm-hmm.
So Mehmed achieves his goal. Constantinople is his. What happens to the city?
He makes it his new capital.
Even though it was in decline.
It was. The population had shrunk, there was a lot of damage from the siege, and a lot of people had fled. But it was still a hugely symbolic victory.
The conquest of Constantinople cemented the Ottoman Empire as a major power in the region, didn't it?
It did, and it sent a message to the West. The Ottomans were here to stay, and they weren't afraid to take on the Christian world.
But the fall of Constantinople wasn't just a military defeat. It had a huge cultural impact too, didn't it?
Absolutely. It led to this mass exodus of Greek scholars who fled to Italy and other parts of Western Europe.
Bringing their knowledge and manuscripts with them.
Exactly. And that had a huge impact on the Renaissance. They brought new ideas, new perspectives. They reintroduced the West to ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been lost or forgotten.
So the fall of Constantinople actually helped fuel the Renaissance.
It was a major factor, for sure. And it led to the rise of the Phanariates.
Who were they?
Those were the Greeks who stayed in Constantinople. They mostly lived in certain districts like the Phanar and Galata.
Why those areas specifically?
It's hard to say for sure, but it might have been for protection or maybe just because that's where they already had communities. And they became very influential within the Ottoman Empire. They served as advisors.